I'm Margaret Grogan, Dean of the School of Educational Studies, and it's a pleasure to see you all here this evening. I'm going to introduce Professor Scott Thomas, who is going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Scott Thomas is a Professor of Education at the School of Educational Studies. He has held academic positions at the University of Georgia, the University of Arizona, and the University of Hawaii. His substantive work bridges K-12 and higher education and focuses on issues related to the stratification of educational experience and opportunities. In addition to this work, Professor Thomas has devoted a considerable amount of effort to research on methodological issues. He is a regular reviewer and editorial board member for several discipline-specific journals and is a co-editor of the International Studies in Higher Education series. And if you ask him nicely, he will tell you the title of his new book that he's writing, which is one of the most least sexy titles I have ever read. Please welcome Dr. Scott Thomas.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Flattered, I should say. So, good evening. My name is Scott Thomas. I'm a professor at CGU, in the School of Educational Studies, and I'm co-director of the Bowen Institute, the sponsor of tonight's lecture. 22 years ago, Howard R. Bowen, who was CGU's 7th president, published his now classic study of higher education entitled Investment in Learning. I forgot my prop. Investment in Learning. Investment in Learning, the subtitle is The Individual and Social Value of American Higher Education. In that work, Bowen delivered a penetrating analysis of the value of higher education. His key argument was that, quote, stick with me on this one, non-monetary benefits so far outweigh that of the monetary benefits that individual and social decisions about higher education should be made purely on the basis of the non-monetary contributions. In other words, the social value far exceeds that of the individual value, and we should think about financing higher education accordingly. That enduring principle has powerfully shaped the commitment of our 26th Bowen lecturer. He is a champion of the idea that higher education yields rich benefits to both the individual and society. His active commitment to the equality of opportunity is singular in its focus and effectiveness over the past 20 years. While I don't want to downplay the significance of his position as CEO and president of the Lumina Foundation for Education, I do want to take a moment to fix his position on an impressive arc of activity that defines our speaker's longstanding commitment to social justice and equality of educational opportunity. Consider 4 examples from a long list. I'm thinking about which 4. He has consistently demonstrated a commitment to access and equality in the United States. In the early 90s, he was the executive director of the National Committee on Responsibilities for Financing Post-Secondary Education. This was a bipartisan committee appointed by the President and Congress that focused on issues of access and affordability to higher education in the United States. At the time, he also had a hand in the development of AmeriCorps, which goes on to today. In 1993, as a second example, Jamie, our speaker, developed the Institute for Higher Education Policy. The Institute is now regarded as one of the world's premier research and policy centers concerned with higher education policy development. He led the Institute for 15 years up until his joining the Lumina Foundation 2 years ago. Under the auspices of the Institute, as a third example, our speaker developed something called the Alliance for Equity in Higher Education. And the Alliance is clearly regarded as one of the most important political developments in the history of minority-serving institutions. This is a coalition of more than 350 minority-serving institutions that is a model of collaboration, unity, and innovation among minority-serving institutions. A fourth area deals with global higher education. And shortly before leaving the Institute, Jamie founded the Global Center on Private Financing of Higher Education. And the mission of the Global Center was to advance the impact of educational opportunities on social and cultural development worldwide. He is a leading authority on university financing, particularly on student aid. His success in research are in part attributable to the simple fact that Jamie is smart and that he gets along with people very, very well. His approach is straightforward without too much posturing. He has an uncanny ability to see through problems right to the core of what matters. He places a high value on the importance of building support and communicating clearly, and this always rests on a foundation of hard and careful work. In the midst of all this, he plays the role of what I would call, being a father myself, a super dad to his 6-year-old son and 18-month-old daughter, while his equally impressive wife, Colleen, keeps him in line and keeps him from getting too serious about all the great work that he's doing. Would you please join me in welcoming tonight's 26th Bowen lecturer, Jamie Merisotis.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for those very generous and kind words. I've known Professor Thomas for a number of years, and I've had the pleasure of following the arc of his career and the great work that he's accomplished. And I really want to thank Dean Grogan and President Huff for this opportunity to be here, to have this unique chance to deliver this year's Howard R. Bowen Lecture. I did not have any opportunity to meet Howard Bowen. However, I'm a consumer of his work, not only that great volume, but of course the Cost of Higher Education and many of the other important works that were written over the course of his career. And in fact, I was giving a speech yesterday, I keep forgetting what day it is, in New York City to a group of 120 or so private college presidents. And after the speech, one of the people who came up to me was Sister Kathleen Ross. And she said, "I understand you're doing the Bowen Lecture tomorrow." And I was very happy to have known Sister Kathleen, who's just now retiring as president of Heritage University, a very impressive American Indian serving institution. It's actually not considered a tribal college for reasons I won't get into with my background in minority serving colleges and universities, but it is, I think, one of the premier institutions in the country serving Native Americans. So thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. This evening I want to speak about the importance of college-level learning and share with you what I and my colleagues at the Lumina Foundation for Education are doing to emphasize the importance of what students who complete courses of study should know and be able to do. Now, on the surface, this might not seem like a very bold theme for a prestigious lecture at such an august, internationally recognized university. But as the not too subtle title of my talk suggests, I have some rather specific things to say about learning that occurs in colleges and universities, and about how we view it at this point in the history of the American higher education system. My thesis is this: we live in a world where much is changing quickly. Economic crises, technology, ideological division, and a host of other factors have all had a profound influence on who we are and what we do in higher education. But when all is said and done, it's imperative that we not lose sight of what matters most. To paraphrase the oft-used maxim of the famous political consultant James Carville, it's the learning, stupid. I think it's important to understand the context for my remarks on college-level learning, which are grounded in what is clearly a very ambitious agenda that we've set for ourselves at Lumina Foundation. Now, I know that many of you are familiar with Lumina Foundation, but for those of you who aren't, let me offer just a very quick overview. Lumina Foundation for Education is a national foundation. We're actually one of the 40 largest of the 7,000 or so private foundations in the country, with assets in excess of $1 billion. This actually makes us the single largest foundation in America that focuses exclusively on getting more Americans into and through college. For most of the 2 years that I've served as the foundation's president, we've pursued that mission by focusing on one specific aim, what we call our big goal. The big goal, simply stated, is that we want to see 60% of Americans with high-quality college degrees and credentials by the year 2025. Now, as many of you know, new figures from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, put the current share of Americans with degrees in this country at essentially the same level that it's been for the last 4 decades, 40%. So, To restate that big goal, over the next 16 years, Lumina wants to increase the percentage of Americans with college degrees, a rate that hasn't increased for 40 years, by 20 percentage points. So you can see why we don't call it the big goal for nothing. We know the goal is ambitious, but we're convinced that it's attainable. I think even more important, we also feel that this goal is vital to the nation's economic stability and social security for several reasons. One obvious reason is global competition. The troubling fact is, college attainment rates are rising in almost every industrialized or post-industrial country in the world, except for the US. In fact, though we led the world for most of the post-war period, our 40% rate now ranks only 10th among developed nations for those between the ages of 25 to 34. In several other countries, more than half of young adults are degree recipients, and rates in many of these countries are continuing to climb. So if we hope to remain competitive and ensure our nation's continued prosperity and stability, we must aim high. And that's one reason for that 60% target. Perhaps even more compelling for reaching that big goal, even a more compelling reason for reaching that big goal, is that our changing workforce demands it. The knowledge economy requires Americans to have more advanced knowledge and skills. Experts agree that today's middle-class jobs, those that ensure a good quality of life for citizens, are less and less attainable without education or training beyond high school. Noted labor economist Tony Carnevale of the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce has estimated that by 2018, 63% of all jobs will require some form of post-secondary education or training. That's a huge increase since the mid-1970s, when less than 30% of jobs required anything beyond a high school education. Carnevale's data fits seamlessly with the latest feedback from employers, most of whom seem to be pleading for better educated workers. In a survey released just last week by the Business Roundtable, 65% of employers said that they require an associate's degree or higher for most positions. Looking ahead 4 years, employers say their greatest need will be for workers with more technical skills, more advanced degrees, and better qualifications. And right now, half of these employers say there's such a serious gap between their needs and their employees' skills that productivity within their companies is actually slipping. Without a doubt, the workplace is becoming much more demanding. If you need a concrete example of that, visit your local auto repair shop, or just pop open the hood of your car and take a look at that complex collection of computerized machinery that your engine has become. A generation ago, nearly 2/3 of America's car mechanics were high school dropouts. Today, more than 1/3 have attended college, and that trend towards higher level skills is sure to continue. So global economic and workforce trends are compelling us to work toward that big goal, but there are other reasons too. One is simply to extend to more individuals the financial benefits of earning a degree. Those benefits are obvious and undeniable. Since 1975, the average annual earnings of the nation's high school graduates fell in real terms, while earnings among high school graduates rose by 19%. And increasing degree completion will bring societal benefits as well. Higher rates of volunteerism, voting, and philanthropic giving, decreased rates of crime and poverty, a reduced need for public assistance, including, quite topically, health care. These are benefits we all share when attainment rates rise. Finally, our big goal is an important means for addressing social inequity. Right now, the benefits that I just listed are being distributed unfairly, and this inequity is a threat to all of us as Americans. Higher education attainment rates among certain populations in this country, including adults, first-generation college-going students, low-income students, and students of color, are significantly lower than those for other students. These achievement gaps have endured for decades, and they're now actually widening. This trend is especially alarming given demographic trends showing that by 2050, so-called minorities will actually constitute a majority of the US population. They already do so in four of the 50 states, here in California, in Texas, in New Mexico, and in Hawaii. So for all of these reasons, you can see why Lumina has embraced this big goal. And it's clear that others have embraced it too, including the President of our country, who's pledged to make the United States the best educated nation in the world by 2020. Policymakers in many states are looking for ways to boost student success rates as a way to improve their long-term economic outlook. Many of our peers, including the Gates Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I already said that, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Ford Foundation, to name just a few, are making significant investments in efforts to improve college completion. So clearly this issue is moving higher on the national agenda. But we at Lumina are convinced it must move up even further. In fact, for the issue of college completion is the agenda. Everything we do is geared toward achieving that goal. And because we're an organization that's relentlessly focused on outcomes, we didn't just stop after we established that goal. Rather, we developed a workable plan to reach it. And we've taken great pains to make that plan accessible, actionable, and widely available. Lumina's strategic plan is not a concept. Some of you have seen it. It's very real and tangible. It truly guides our decisions and our work. It's clearly delineated in a strategic planning document that we've printed and disseminated widely. There's no secret plan that we're actually following. This is it, and it's been widely available, including via our website. Our strategic plan identifies 3 critical outcomes, 3 significant results that must be produced for our big goal to be reached. Those 3 outcomes are, first, students must be prepared academically, financially, and socially for success in education beyond high school. These are co-equals in that equation. Second, higher education attainment rates must be improved significantly. I'll come back to that one. And third, higher education must become more productive so that it can increase its capacity and therefore serve more students. Of course, we know we can't reach any of these 3 major outcomes in one step. A number of intermediate steps will be necessary in each of these areas to get where we need to be. To give you a better understanding of how Lumina approaches this work, let me take just one of these 3 critical outcomes and unpack it to show you what we think needs to happen and what we plan to do at Lumina in that area. Keeping in mind that steady progress needs to be made on all of the outcomes if we're to reach that 60% goal, let's look closely today only at success. We believe that to significantly increase higher education attainment rates, 3 intermediate outcomes must occur first. The first is that higher education needs to use proven strategies to move students to completion. We do not need to reinvent or invent a whole bunch of new strategies. Second, quality data must be used to improve student performance and inform policy and decision making at all levels. My colleagues who are graduate students heard my speech on that issue this afternoon. The third is that the outcomes of student learning must be defined, measured, and aligned with workforce needs. Now, to achieve these outcomes and thus improve the success rates, Lumina has decided to pursue several specific strategies. I'll cite just a few of these many different strategies. We're now advocating for the redesign, rebranding, and improvement of developmental education. We're exploring the development of alternative pathways to degrees and credentials. We're pushing for smoother systems of transferring credit so that students can move more easily between institutions. So again, these are just illustrations of the strategies we've identified as closely aligned with the outcomes of increasing student success. But I think you get the main idea here. We at Lumina see specific outcomes that must be achieved. We've identified specific steps to help us reach those outcomes, and we've shared those steps very publicly in a thorough and transparent plan of action. Ironically, there's one aspect of our strategic plan that's loomed especially large lately. I say ironically because the item I'm referring to is literally a footnote in the strategic plan document. Footnote 1, in fact. There, in tiny type at the bottom of page 1, it whispers to us. And nothing gets your attention like a whisper, right? It says in part, Lumina defines high-quality credentials as degrees and certificates that have well-defined and transparent learning outcomes which provide clear pathways to further education and employment. As we pursue our big goal, we're increasingly convinced that ensuring the quality of degrees is every bit as important as increasing the quantity. These are not concepts that are constantly in a war of competing tension or part of some sort of zero-sum game in which increases in one inevitably lead to decreases in the other. And as footnote 1 softly but incessantly reminds us, quality at its core must be a measure of what students actually learn and are able to do with the knowledge and skills they gain. Now, oddly enough, this concept of learning, a subject that seems critical to every discussion in higher education, is often overlooked in the modern era. We all talk endlessly about the processes of higher education, about ensuring access and fostering student success, about increasing college completion rates, about aligning standards. And yet we seem reluctant or perhaps unable to discuss higher education's true purpose, equipping students for success in life. We need to confront some important questions. What exactly are students learning? And what should they be learning? What knowledge and skills must they have so that they can thrive, both as workers in the 21st century global economy and as productive citizens in this democracy? Confronting these questions is not just an exercise. Like Lumina's strategic plan, it's practical, it's tactical, and it's very real. And it points to what we at Lumina see as a huge opportunity for higher education and for the nation. In fact, without a renewed focus on what students are actually learning, there's really no way to properly ensure the quality and value of a college degree or credential. Research has already shown that higher education institutions vary significantly in the value they add to students in terms of what those students actually learn. Various tools and instruments tell us that some institutions add more value than others, even when looking at students with similar backgrounds and abilities. Now, these tools are helpful, but more work is needed in this area. We need to find more and more consistent ways to measure a college's or a university's value-added capabilities. We need to find ways to better ensure that credits, degrees, and credentials actually represent the skills and knowledge students obtain and can demonstrate. Learning, that is, the knowledge, skills, and competencies a student gains by taking a course or program, really needs to be recognized as the primary measure of quality in higher education. Right now, that is unfortunately not the case. In fact, for many Americans, a quality education has no real connection to the actual knowledge a student gains or the skills he or she develops in college. Rather, it's largely a function of reputation or prestige. In other words, a degree from an elite college or university is seen as a high-quality degree. Degrees and credentials from lesser institutions are thought to be of inferior quality. That's because, in nearly all cases, perceptions of quality in higher education are now based on inputs rather than on measurable outcomes. To put it crudely, and yes, perhaps even stupidly, high quality happens when high-achieving students attend highly selective, richly endowed institutions where tradition, along with well-paid faculty and other resources, ensures their predictable success. The question is, what do these students actually learn? How much do they improve? What do they really gain? What do we as a society gain from their attendance? And do we as citizens and taxpayers gain more when a less selective public institution or a community college takes a B- student, or maybe even one not typically thought of as college material, and helps ensure the success of that student? In addition, the relevance of what students learn is important. Is the learning linked to the student's needs and interests? Will it lead to further education and further employment? Right now, unfortunately, these questions are largely rhetorical. That's because there's too little credible data to justify the quality distinctions that are often made in higher education. We simply aren't doing enough to measure the specific learning that takes place in individual courses and degree programs. In most cases, we can't really tell what value an institution truly adds to its students' lives. Clearly, this needs to change. My colleagues and I at Lumina Foundation believe strongly that the American higher education system must move away from the input-based definitions of quality that so often dominate rankings to a value-added approach, one that's firmly rooted in measurable outcomes. And what's the most important thing we ought to measure? Well, I think you know my answer by now. It's the learning. We understand that such measurement is relatively new and that it's not easy. But we can no longer argue, as I think some have done, that most of what we do in higher education is not measurable. Tools like the voluntary system of accountability and the collegiate learning assessment have already demonstrated that it is possible. No tool is perfect, and no single tool should ever drive decision-making for such a complex endeavor as learning. However, we do need to learn from the tools that already exist and build on their success. Now, here in California, home of the Early Assessment Program, EAP, evidence of the learning that can occur has already been unfolding for 5 years. As I think most of you are probably aware, this measures students' college readiness during the junior year in high school and then helps enhance that preparation the following year prior to college enrollment. In just 5 years, EAP has become a national model. Some might say the national model for how to align K-12 and higher education in terms of objectively measuring what students know and can do. The program is effective because high school teachers and college faculty members sat down together, talked about, and decided what students actually need to know to be successful in college math and English. They then figured out how to make sure all high school students in California can see where they stand in terms of readiness. And they can see it in time for the unprepared students to actually do something about it. This is a terrific model, but it's just one tool. The lessons it's teaching us as the transition between high school and college need to be applied more broadly and more consistently, particularly in higher education. In fact, my Lumina colleagues and I believe those lessons need to be applied systematically throughout higher education. An intense and systematic focus on learning should be the hallmark of higher education, from the freshman year through graduate school. For us, learning doesn't just matter, it matters most of all. Again, that idea seems so fundamental, so basic, and yet learning, how to define it, how to measure it, how to nurture it in students and ensure its relevance and currency in the world, the topic that should be the central conversation about improving education, has somehow devolved to background noise. If I may, I'd like to bring it to the forefront this evening and discuss it in a little more detail. Learning outcomes in higher education can be grouped into two fundamental categories: generalizable, transferable skills such as abstract reasoning, critical thinking, problem solving, communication, and subject-specific skills and knowledge. Traditionally, we've thought of these as being acquired in different areas or levels of education. General education, or the undergraduate core, has been the place where students develop high-level thinking. Field-specific knowledge and skills are developed in the student's major or occupational field. This two-track concept may help us understand the importance of each type of learning, but it can hamper our understanding of how learning really happens. That's because I think you all recognize it represents a false dichotomy. In today's economy and society, both types of learning are necessary for everyone. Both are vital in the workforce and everyday life, and both must be developed together at all levels of higher education. As I indicated earlier, the quality distinction in Lumina's goal is critical. As I'm sure you'll agree, increasing the number of degree holders without ensuring the quality of those degrees would be a very hollow achievement for this nation, a major step backward even. Clearly, maintaining high quality in college credentials, even improving on that quality in coming years, is a must if we hope to remain globally competitive and to ensure that robust middle class. Much work remains to flesh out the definition of quality in Lumina's footnote 1, to hone it more precisely and specifically on what students in various fields of study must know and what skills they must possess to succeed in life and in their chosen fields. That's why a focus on what students are really learning must go hand in hand with the efforts to improve graduation rates. And this means that all institutions, 2- and 4-year, public and private, online and brick and mortar, for-profit and not-for-profit, all must focus on and measure what's being learned. They must clearly define what students should know and be able to do, help their students achieve those outcomes, and accurately track institutional and student performance. At Lumina, we're looking very closely at various tools, tactics, and systems that can help in that task. We see our work as supporting and advancing the work of others who've been toiling in this field for some time, like the Association of American Colleges and Universities and its work on liberal learning outcomes, led by the many good faculty that have taken learning and its assessment seriously in their courses, but whose work has not rolled up into coherent frameworks for whole programs and degrees. We see a great deal of promise in several of these efforts, including some that we're actively funding. We think they can lead to real progress in redefining quality in higher education. Let me mention just a few examples, many of which you know. I think the best known is the Collegiate Learning Assessment, or CLA. CLA helps institutions measure how well it contributes to a student's mastery of higher order thinking skills. It's not subject or major specific. Students who take the CLA are presented with realistic problems that require them to analyze complex materials. Their written responses are evaluated to assess their ability to think critically, to reason analytically, to solve problems, and to communicate clearly. Another good example is the Voluntary System of Accountability, or VSA. VSA, as its name indicates, is a voluntary initiative developed by four-year institutions to increase institutional transparency and to provide a tool to help students in their college searches. One of its major goals is to measure a specific set of educational results as a step towards improving educational practices. The Collegiate Assessment of Academic Proficiency, or CAP, is a standardized test from ACT that enables colleges and universities to assess what students learn in general education programs. Similarly, the Measure of Academic Proficiency and Progress, or MAP, developed conveniently by ETS, is another tool for assessing these types of learning. Both of these instruments can be cited as part of an institution's publicly reported VSA profile. Yet another example is the Voluntary Framework for Accountability, or VFA. This is a new effort similar to the VSA, except that it's being specifically developed for use at community colleges, an increasingly vital sector in higher education and one in which Lumina has invested substantially. Now, this just announced project includes not only Lumina, but also the Gates Foundation, the College Board, the American Association of Community Colleges, and the Association of Community College Trustees as partners. Finally, the Transparency by Design project, another Lumina-funded effort which is just getting underway, will attempt to gather reliable information about learning in online programs, another vital and growing sector, particularly for serving adult students. All of these studies and programs demonstrate that throughout American higher education, people are developing, using, and reporting on common metrics that attempt to show what students really learn. But we shouldn't limit ourselves to American higher education when pursuing this new emphasis on learning. After all, we live in and compete in a global society. Shouldn't we know how other countries are educating their systems, especially when some of them are outperforming us? Though it's probably unwise and perhaps even impossible to import systems directly from abroad, we should certainly take good ideas and adapt them to the American system. That's why we're also pursuing several important international projects that can inform our learning outcomes work. Let me share just two examples. First, we're working with OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to develop a method to compare learning outcomes across national borders. Called a HALO, for Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes, this project seeks to measure what undergraduate students internationally know and can do. The goal is to improve upon these results and better link them to the needs of the global workforce. Second, we're taking a long, hard look at the Bologna process. As you may know, this is the process by which 46 European countries have been working for a decade to promote transparency, coordination, and quality assurance among various national higher education systems. As the Bologna group sought to establish a set of commonly understood and commonly accepted post-secondary credentials, the organizers came upon an idea called tuning, which we at Lumina think may apply reasonably well in this country. The idea with tuning is to take various programs within a specific discipline, history, chemistry, psychology, whatever, and agree on a set of learning outcomes that a degree in the field represents. The goal is not for the various programs to teach exactly the same thing in the same way, or even for all of the programs to offer the same courses. Rather, programs can employ whatever techniques they prefer, so long as their students can demonstrate mastery of an agreed-upon body of knowledge and set of skills. To use the musical terminology, the various programs are not expected to play the same notes, but to be tuned to the same key. Tuning is, very importantly, a faculty-led process that also involves students and takes into account the perspectives of employers and recent graduates to define what a student in a particular discipline should be able to know and do upon earning a degree or credential in that field. Earlier this year, Lumina launched a pilot project called Tuning USA, in which faculty members, students, and education officials in 3 states, Indiana, Minnesota, and Utah, are drafting sets of learning outcomes in a total of 6 disciplines: biology, chemistry, education, history, physics, and graphic design. They'll also attempt to map the links between those outcomes and graduates' employment options. The teams in all 3 states are attacking the work enthusiastically, and we're eager to learn what they've come up with. But whatever emerges from Tuning USA, we know that its underlying message, the message conveyed by all of the projects that I've discussed here this evening, will ring loud and clear. Learning doesn't just matter, it matters most. All of these efforts, and others that I think I lack time to mention this evening, are rooted in and serve to amplify 2 basic truths. The first is that learning, all types of learning, can be objectively measured. And the second is that these measurements are absolutely vital to ensuring the relevance and the value of a college credential. Measuring learning isn't just about testing students' recall and understanding of facts, formulas, theories, and processes, though content knowledge is certainly important. Increasingly, successful learning is seen as being dynamic and flexible. It's not so much what students know these days, rather it's about mastering the skills required to constantly know more and to use what we know. Students need to learn how to learn. Certainly, it's easier to measure and to test for knowledge of facts and formulas than it is to assess a student's mastery of skills, such as critical thinking, analytic reasoning, and the ability to break down and solve problems. But it's not impossible. The projects that I've discussed are creating and refining these kinds of measurements. But we have a long way to go. These and similar efforts must continue and intensify in incoming years. By doing this work, we'll be able to better ensure the relevance of the degrees and credentials that our colleges and universities already award. This issue of relevance is particularly acute right now when our economy is being tested in unprecedented ways. We need to abandon our historic view in higher education that we don't train people for jobs. Of course we do. That doesn't mean it's the only thing we do. But to deny that job skills development is one of the key purposes of higher education is increasingly untenable. Education also must equip people with the skills they need to adapt in whatever way is necessary as their lives change, their jobs evolve, and new opportunities arise. Unlocking the learning puzzle is important because it's really our only viable strategy to ensuring individual and social success over the long haul. After all, what we know and can do, coupled with our ability to learn, is the one thing that multiplies and magnifies our options in life. If we hope to keep all of those options open, we need to get a better handle on how to measure what students are learning. For this reason, and really for a growing number of reasons, we need a national approach to determining what people with specific degrees and credentials know and can do. A focus on learning naturally leads us to some very practical and useful steps that can improve higher education for individuals, for states, and for the nation as a whole. If we focus on learning as a priority, we'll improve the interaction between K-12 and higher education. We'll find ways to ease students' transfer between institutions, especially transfer between community colleges and bachelor's degree granting programs. By defining quality in terms of learning, we'll foster innovation. This is critical if we hope to effectively serve more students. Finally, we'll create more tools that can help us better assess prior learning or experiential learning among returning adults and military veterans. We need to recognize that not all people start higher education in the same place. Any of these steps, all stemming from a focus on learning, could bring about massive improvements in higher education. Of course, it will require work and time and patience for states and higher education institutions, working closely with faculty, employers, and students to make the shift from a more input-oriented approach to one that's driven by clearly defined outcomes. And that shift will certainly be more difficult in some states than in others. Anyone who's heard or seen news reports in the last year surely must appreciate the enormity of California's fiscal problems. Just last week in San Francisco, I had an opportunity to be one of an opening tandem of speakers keynoting the annual meeting of the Association of Community College Trustees. My tandem partner, Governor Schwarzenegger, said in his remarks that the situation facing public higher education budgets is unprecedented. Interesting coming from him. These budgetary challenges can't help but hamper even the best efforts of higher education institutions and officials in this state. And yet there are relevant and worthwhile options even here. Steps that could generate huge payoffs in California's human potential. For instance, by simply making a commitment to better assessing prior learning, the state of California could unlock a wealth of this potential. Census figures show that 23% of the state's working age population, that's 4.2 million people between the ages of 25 and 64, have attended college but lack even a 2-year degree. In other words, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Californians are quite close to college completion. If they could demonstrate college-level knowledge and skills arising from their life and their work experiences, how much closer would we be to that big goal? Today, there are also 49,000 California veterans enrolled in college using GI Bill benefits, and the VA is approving 300 applications every day for post-9/11 GI benefits in California. These veterans are returning to this state with significant education, training, and experience. Some of that shows up as credit on a college transcript, but much of it, including vital skills like leadership, critical thinking, and teamwork, does not. Wouldn't it be great if all of this knowledge and these skills could be assessed and recognized by both employers and the education system? Wouldn't that help these veterans and millions more adults like them move more rapidly and through the higher education system? And wouldn't that benefit all of us? Well, certainly I think you see my point. Benefits not just for a few, but for all of us. That's the promise of higher education. And that's the ultimate purpose behind Lumina's pursuit of that big goal, behind everything that we do. So as I conclude my remarks to you this evening, let me reaffirm my central thesis. I know you appreciate higher education's promise of a better life. For many of you, and certainly for me, that promise is fulfilled every day in dozens of ways. You know, as I know, that opportunities to learn are a precious gift that truly matters. So at the end of the day, with the debates about state funding, about tuition and financial aid, about accreditation and government regulation, about tenure, about teacher education, about retaining students, and about a whole range of other terribly important processes and systems, let's remember what this great enterprise we call higher education is all about. It's the learning. And that is what matters most. Thank you all very much for this opportunity.
Floor is open for questions.
Comments, cat calls. Alicia.
Thank you. In your strategic planning process, was there a discussion of what is viewed as the underlying problem that got us into the state of affairs of the chronic achievement gap?
There was a lot of discussion about the nature of the problem that got us there, and I think part of what we're reflecting in terms of our outcomes demonstrates that, right? Which is that on the preparation side, the challenges of academic preparation, financial preparation, and social preparation combined have created a huge disconnect between what we need from our higher education system and what's being presented to our higher education system in terms of enrolling students. Another challenge that we've confronted is that we've fundamentally changed as a society. There's been a rapid change in terms of our demographic profile, in terms of the nature of who students are coming through the system, whether it's through the K-12 system or whether they're adults returning to get some level of post-secondary education. I don't think that the system has really recognized that dramatic change in terms of the nature of students, meeting students where they are, as we like to say, in terms of their work. And I think another is something that I didn't touch on tonight, but I think is terribly important, which is that we've had fundamentally a failure of leadership. And by failure of leadership, I mean a failure of leadership primarily in our public policy processes. That is, we've failed to, we in higher education now, have failed to convince policymakers that what we do has all of those benefits that I was talking about before. I do not think in this time of our history we can go forward and say if we only restore the funding cuts, everything's going to be okay. If we only get back to where we were, we're going to produce the kinds of results you're looking for. They don't believe it. They will not buy it. Those days are over. So what we've got to do is change the game and get ahead of that conversation. And in my view, this emphasis on learning is one of the key ways to get ahead of that conversation. I'm convinced in that productivity goal that I mentioned as one of our three major outcomes, that the objective of productivity, and I mentioned this afternoon in some of my conversations, is not to do more with less. That's old, that's tired, that doesn't work. What we need to do is, in the most efficient and effective way possible, get the most out of the system in terms of those high-quality degree attainment rates. Use the resources that we do have to increase the capacity of the system. If we do that, I spent 2 decades of my life in public policy on many different levels. I am convinced that policymakers will invest more if we demonstrate those results. We have not been able to demonstrate those results, in my opinion, and that's a big problem. Now that gets to the problem of data systems, which I mentioned as well. We also have a problem in terms of not being able to prove some of what I think we already do, but I think that's a critical element of this.
You talked about how great it would be if we could recognize the experience that people have.
Yeah, I knew the experiential learning, the prior learning assessment was going to get some attention, so go ahead.
So here's the attention.
Yes.
So are you suggesting then that we somehow translate those experiences into college credits? And if so, how does that change what a college degree means?
Yeah. I don't know if the answer is to translate them into college credits. That's certainly the conversation that's taking place right now. I think it's a fairly simplistic notion, because I think the problem with college credits is that credits are based on seat time. They're not really based on those learning outcomes that I was talking about. So I think we need a sort of more holistic view of how to reform the system. But ideally, if students can demonstrate what they know and can do with a credential, they should get some acknowledgement of that. I don't want to say credit, because that's a different conversation, but some acknowledgement of that. And I think this is one of the things that we've failed to acknowledge, is that students do have those life experiences. They do come to the table with skills and knowledge, and not all of that is simply knowledge transmission that comes from higher education institutions. It's difficult to argue that someone coming out of the military does not have significant leadership, critical thinking, and analytic skills that we should recognize and value as part of the higher education system. To make someone who's come out of a military context start at the beginning and build those skills seems wasteful, it seems inefficient, and I don't think ultimately we're doing them any service by making them take the time to go through that process. Time, by the way, is one of our biggest enemies in this entire process. It takes too long to get the credential. It's particularly difficult for adult students to go through the process. And if there are ways in which we can accelerate the time, developing a more efficient system, prior learning assessment is one of a panoply of options. I'm all for it. But the prior learning assessment only works if we are measuring the learning, and that's the critical element. So the kinds of prior learning assessment that we're talking about right now largely don't work, in my opinion. The kinds of things, the classic, we're going to give you credit for life experience, but what does that mean? I don't know what that means. But if we can become specific about those skills that we expect, whether they're content specific or generalizable, that we can test, and there's some examples of these kinds of things already taking place, like the Western Governors University. I think that that's worth building on, studying, and trying to see if we can get some scalability out of it. But it's one tool in the toolbox.
I really appreciate what you said, and I think it's provoked some new thinking on my part. But I do have one question. I just recently read a study that reported that 2 million Americans are illiterate, totally. Another 7 million cannot read 4th grade level. Another 20 million cannot fill out a job application. If you've got even that many, and the study indicated there are probably more, that adds up to 29 million Americans out of a population of 100 who have absolutely no capacity to read in any productive sense. Part of the problem, isn't it, in the dropouts from junior college and from other colleges, the fact that people have graduated from high school and can't read?
You bet. You bet. I mean, that's a critical element of that preparation that I was talking about, which is that, you know, you mentioned literacy as an example. I mean, that's a critical problem.
It is.
In terms of getting to those completion rates.
And it's growing every day.
Yeah, and I mentioned in some conversations this afternoon, one of the biggest issues, in my opinion, one of the areas where we could see significant change is in developmental education. There's a reality. The reality is students come to higher education institutions with deficiencies. And we have to accept that reality. We can't spend, as we have for much of the last 2 decades, pointing fingers, right? Saying, whose fault was that? Somebody's got to fix that. And, you know, we've so stigmatized developmental education that students don't want to take it, faculty don't want to teach it, and policymakers don't want to pay for it. Policymakers think they've already paid for it in the K-12 system, so they don't want to pay for it again.
Right.
My answer to that is, this is reality. First of all, the majority of students who are in developmental programs are actually adults, so their K-12 experience is not relevant to the developmental needs that they have because it's too long ago. But more importantly, we've crossed a critical threshold with students who are in developmental programs. They've expressed an interest. That is a big step forward that we should take advantage of. And what happens is we fail. We fail the vast majority of students in developmental programs. That is one of the sad, dirty little secrets of higher education that I think does not serve us well with policymakers. But because we've stigmatized the process. So what's the answer? The answer is to develop a different approach to it, to create a different reward system, both for the institutions and for the people who are teaching developmental courses in order to be able to advance the field, get those students into fully matriculated programs and get them to that credential. So that's a big part of the equation. But again, that's only one piece. You know, I can't help but mention one other thing about this issue of literacy that you mentioned. So my new home state, I spent 21 years in Washington, D.C. before I went to Indiana 2 years ago. My new home state of Indiana, we have 1 million residents in the state who are working in the manufacturing sector, for whom they have no short-term job prospects without additional education and training because of the changing nature of the job market, the economy, etc. 1 million citizens in a state the size of Indiana. What are we going to do for those 1 million people? We are currently in the United States graduating 2.3 million people with college degrees and credentials. We have 1 million in Indiana who need credentials. So we have a big challenge ahead of us to try to address those needs. But there's an urgency. If we don't address the needs of those populations, their short-term problems with unemployment and other things become long-term problems in terms of welfare dependency, in terms of devolving life, etc. So that becomes a huge, huge challenge for us. Steve.
So I really agree with the emphasis on learning, and it's obviously very important for individuals, for their long-term prospects in life. But I'm going to probe on your faith in the state.
Mm-hmm.
I just looked at the VSA.
Yeah.
There are 320 participating institutions. And there are some, like the University of Texas, Permian Basin,
Yeah.
and El Paso, where they show CLA scores above expected. Why would we believe the state is going to say, aha, Permian Basin is doing a great job, let's give them more money?
Yeah.
I don't think, my experience suggests that that's not the way states work.
I think it's a fair criticism of VSA. One of the reasons why we supported VSA from the beginning was that it was a potential game changer. When we started out, we said, okay, well this could just be an excuse for public higher education institutions to claim that they're actually doing accountability when they're really not. But when we got into the conversation, what we realized is that this has created a lot of peer pressure within the sector to focus on accountability and to get closer to those learning goals. And I'll give you a really concrete example. So the last few years, I've been going to this meeting sponsored by the Forum on the Future of Higher Education at the Aspen Institute. And these are very high capability institutions, public and private institutions who are participating in this conversation. 3 years ago, when I was talking about learning, productivity of higher education, they tried to show me the back door. Now, because of VSA, because of the pressure that's being applied more broadly on productivity, these are really receptive and engaged conversations, and I'm convinced that the focus on learning is coming as a result of that kind of pressure. Is VSA the solution? Absolutely not. It is a means to an end. Now, if it's treated as an end by these states, then they're wrong. So I share your concern about the VSA, but I think the VSA, sort of the driving, getting everything to drive in the same direction, VSA is a powerful tool to get there. The danger, and I think you're suggesting this, is that it could become an excuse. I can say, well, we're doing VSA, we don't have any problem. And that's a danger we can protect against, and that's something that we can push back against with our bully pulpit.
You have time for one more question. I'd like to ask a question as a devil's advocate. I'm totally in line with what you're saying. My own work is about measurable outcomes, about developing mathematical models. I'm a true believer in it. But as I'm sitting here, there's a question nobody seems to be asking, and I feel both sides should be represented in any academic discussion, so I'm going to ask it. We have a rich mosaic of higher education institutions with different goals, different methods, different purposes, all the way from, say, St. John's College, where they focus on the classics and students begin by learning Greek so they can read the classics in the original Greek, to West Point, to MIT, to Evergreen, to all these different institutions with different purposes. Is there a danger that by regularizing the outcomes of learning, we lose the spirit of creative inquiry?
It's a question we get all the time, and so thank you for the softball. Of course that danger.
I'm on your team.
Of course that danger exists. If we're not vigilant, I think that danger does exist. Experience, however, with what the Europeans have done with the tuning process suggests otherwise. The Europeans have now been doing this tuning for a decade in a couple dozen different disciplines. And that is, in fact, not at all what has happened. In fact, in some cases, in some of the disciplines, it's added to the diversity of the delivery system and the teaching methods as a result. But I would say that one of the things that we've already learned from our tuning experiment is that faculty are getting together in these disciplines, and this is just one element of this, obviously, the tuning approach. Faculty are getting together, and they're having real difficulty in articulating what the differences are in degree level between what students should know and be able to do with credentials in certain disciplines. And that raises a troubling and profound question for those faculty, which is, so what is it that we're doing that's differentiating in terms of this system? Is that going to result in some sort of homogenized system? I highly doubt it. I think that's motivation for people to develop different pedagogies, different approaches, but they're very clearly focused on trying to get towards much more clearly articulated goals at each of the degree levels, and then being able to achieve those goals with a very rich set of institutions and programs. My final comment is, I believe strongly in the diversity of American higher education. It has been and continues to be one of its greatest strengths. The fact that we have public and private, 2- and 4-year, minority-serving institutions, women's colleges, this is part of the rich fabric of American higher education, and we should not dilute that in any way as a result of this outcome-based approach.
Jamie, I'd like that to be your final set of questions, but since it was a technical tie between David and Daryl on that question, I'll have to give one more to Daryl.
Such pressure. That's another question. I love learning, assessment, and all of that good stuff. We've been at it now for 30 years, and we still are planning to plan. far as I know. And I'm trying to juxtapose that process and discussion of outcomes and what everybody should be able to do with the loss of generations we have had now, not only into education in general, to the dropouts at every level of education, but to the sciences and mathematics. And so I feel some real urgency. You've got a big goal, 2025.
Yeah.
Some of what you talk about sounds like a saunter to the, we're academics. Ask them to define something and we could spend the next 20 years arguing about it.
Yeah.
What is it that you see from your vantage point now that are the driving to have this real change occur in that, for that big goal for 2025? This is already 2010.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to do, again, many of you have read the strategic plan, so I'm telling you things you already know. But you've got to continue to focus on changing practice. That's really important. But changing practice isn't going to get us there fast enough. We've got to focus on getting scalable change for those practices that have demonstrated the greatest results. But we do have evidence of what can lead to greater results. And so part of that has to do with what we outline in terms of our other catalytic strategies, catalytic approaches. Advancing public policy, this is something that most of us in philanthropy don't do or don't do very well. This is a big part of what we're trying to do, is to educate, inform, and ultimately influence policymaker decisions around these kind of questions. Any of you who's had a conversation with a state legislator in the last few years will recognize that they have incredibly simplistic, outdated notions of higher education. But it's useful to go through that process to say, my God, they're talking about a system that no longer exists, because it's their own experience. They're reflecting their own experience, or they're reflecting what they think their experience was, probably. And that system fundamentally no longer exists. So that's a big challenge. The other is, again from the strategic plan, you cannot underestimate the importance of changing the public's will for this kind of scalable change. You've got to convince the public that this matters, or there won't be the kind of pressure for us to change what we're doing in the institutions, and the pressure on policymakers to make the right investments to get to that kind of change. And I think changing public will is a very serious hurdle. Some think that's the craziest of our three catalytic approaches, that we're somehow going to penetrate the psyche of the public on these kind of issues. But ultimately, there's an opportunity with the public will building right now because of that connection to jobs. I mean, I recognize the inherent dangers of excess focus on jobs as one of the critical outcomes. But we should seize this moment right now, because that is a way for the public to understand how important this is and how important the stakes are if we don't invest in the success of the higher education system. Consequences are enormous in terms of the potential for negative outcomes for our country. We will not die a slow, painful death. It will be a precipitous decline, in my opinion, if we don't make the right kinds of investments. Look at the evidence from the rest of the world. Look at how much has changed in 1 decade. In Korea, in Japan, in Sweden, in countries who we've collaborated with, in the UK, in Australia. A lot is changing very rapidly. A decade from now, if we're still having these kind of nice conversations, we're going to we're not going to be 15th in the world, we're going to be 30th. And I think that that's a really frightening danger for our country. Thank you very much.